Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the community center's main hall, watching dozens of veterans and their families fill the folding chairs. The annual Veterans Day gathering in her small Texas town had grown bigger each year, but tonight felt different. Tonight she was supposed to speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the sleeves of her navy blazer, making sure they covered the scars that mapped her forearms like a roadway of painful memories. At 32, Sarah looked younger than her years, but her dark eyes held depth that spoke of experiences far beyond her age. Most people in Millfield knew her as the quiet woman who worked at the local clinic, always helpful, but never one to share much about herself. What they didn't know was that Sarah Martinez had served as a Navy SEAL medic for 8 years, one of the first women to break through that barrier. What they couldn't see were the invisible wounds that ran deeper than any physical scar, the memories that kept her awake at night, and the words that had become trapped somewhere between her heart and her mouth. The event organizer, Mrs. Henderson, approached with a warm smile. She was a motherly woman in her 60s, whose own son had served in Vietnam. "Sarah, dear, are you ready? We'd love to hear your story tonight. These young folks need to know what real service looks like." Sarah nodded, though her throat felt tight. She had agreed to speak 3 weeks ago during a moment of clarity, thinking perhaps it was time to finally share what she had experienced. But now, surrounded by expectant faces, the familiar silence crept back in. She found herself thinking about Dr. James Patterson, the VA counselor who had worked with her for 2 years after her discharge. He had been patient, understanding, never pushing too hard. "The words will come when you're ready," he had often said. "Trauma has a way of stealing our voice, but it can't keep it forever." Sarah made her way to a seat in the back row, hoping to blend in. Around her, she heard fragments of conversations between other veterans. Some spoke easily about their service, sharing stories with the casual familiarity of old friends. Others, like herself, sat quietly, listening but not contributing. A young man in his early 20s sat beside her, fidgeting with a program. She noticed the telltale signs of recent deployment, the precise haircut, the way he scanned the room, the slight tension in his shoulders. When their eyes met, he offered a small nod of recognition that veterans often shared. "First time at one of these?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "You?" "Yeah, just got back from Afghanistan 6 months ago. Marine Corps. People keep telling me I should talk about it, but..." He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Sarah understood completely. The expectation to share, to process, to somehow make sense of experiences that defied easy explanation weighed heavily on many veterans. Society wanted heroes with clean, inspiring stories, but the reality was often messier, more complicated. The evening began with the usual ceremonies: the presentation of colors, the Pledge of Allegiance, a moment of silence for fallen comrades. Sarah participated automatically, her body going through motions while her mind drifted to other ceremonies in other places, where flags had covered the bodies of friends who wouldn't be coming home. Mrs. Henderson took the microphone and began introducing the evening's speakers. There would be 3 veterans sharing their experiences: a Vietnam veteran who had become a successful businessman, a Iraq War veteran who had started a nonprofit for homeless veterans, and Sarah. As the first speaker told his story of returning home to protest and eventually finding his place in civilian life, Sarah's mind wandered to her own homecoming. There had been no protests, but there had been something equally challenging: the well-meaning questions from family and friends who couldn't understand why she seemed so different, why the confident young woman who had left for the military had returned quiet and withdrawn. Her parents had tried to help. They had thrown a small welcome home party, inviting relatives and family friends who wanted to congratulate her on her service. But Sarah had found herself unable to connect with their enthusiasm. How could she explain that the person they were celebrating felt like a stranger to her? How could she describe the weight of carrying memories that seemed too heavy for ordinary conversation? The second speaker, the Iraq veteran, spoke passionately about his work helping homeless veterans. His story was one of transformation, of taking his own struggles and turning them into purpose. Sarah admired his ability to find meaning in his pain, to articulate his journey in a way that inspired action. But as his speech continued, Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The expectations were building. Soon it would be her turn to stand up there, to somehow make sense of her own experience, to offer inspiration and hope. The problem was, she wasn't sure she had found those things yet herself. The young Marine beside her seemed to sense her tension. "You okay?" he whispered. Sarah managed a small smile. "Just nervous. What branch?" he asked. "Navy," she replied, keeping it simple. He nodded respectfully. "My uncle was Navy. Said you guys saw some heavy stuff. If only he knew," Sarah thought. Her service hadn't been on a ship or at a traditional base. As a SEAL medic, she had been embedded with teams that operated in the most dangerous areas, providing medical support for missions that most people would never hear about. She had seen combat in ways that few people, even other veterans, could imagine. The memories tried to surface, the sound of gunfire, the feeling of blood on her hands as she worked to save wounded teammates, the faces of people she couldn't save. She pushed them back down, focusing on the present moment, on the warm community center and the safe faces around her. Mrs. Henderson was now introducing her, listing her military decorations in a voice filled with pride. Sarah heard the words Purple Heart and Silver Star, awards that felt like they belonged to someone else. The audience turned to look at her, their expressions expectant and respectful. Sarah stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady. As she walked toward the front of the room, she wondered if tonight would finally be the night she found her voice again, or if the silence that had protected her for so long would win once more. Sarah reached the podium and looked out at the expectant faces. The microphone felt cold in her hands, and for a moment the familiar silence threatened to overwhelm her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The audience waited patiently, their expressions kind and encouraging. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Thank you for having me tonight." The words felt foreign, like she was speaking a language she had almost forgotten. She gripped the podium tighter, her knuckles turning white. In the back of her mind, she could hear Dr. Patterson's voice. "Start small. Just one truth at a time. My name is Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice growing slightly stronger. "I served in the Navy for 8 years. She paused, knowing that what came next would change how everyone in this room saw her. "I was a SEAL medic." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Even in 2019, female Navy SEALs were rare enough that many people had never met one. She saw the young Marine's eyes widen with respect and recognition. "I know what some of you are thinking," Sarah continued, finding her rhythm slightly. "A woman in the SEALs? It wasn't easy. Actually, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm not just talking about the physical training." She thought back to those early days at basic underwater demolition SEAL training. She had been one of only 3 women in her class and the only one to complete the program. The physical challenges had been brutal, but the mental pressure had been even worse. Every day she had to prove herself not just capable, but exceptional. "I grew up here in Texas," she said, her voice growing more steady. "I was always the kid who wanted to help people. When someone got hurt on the playground, I was the one with the Band-Aids. When my little brother broke his arm falling out of a tree, I was the one who stayed calm and called for help." The audience was listening intently now. Sarah could feel their attention, and surprisingly, it didn't feel as overwhelming as she had expected. These were her neighbors, her community. They weren't judging her. They were simply listening. "I joined the Navy right after high school," she continued. "I wanted to be a medic, but I also wanted to push myself, to see what I was really capable of. When I learned about the opportunities for women in special operations, I knew that was my path." What she didn't tell them was how her family had reacted. Her mother had cried. Her father had tried to talk her out of it, and her younger brother had alternated between worry and pride. They had wanted her to choose a safer path, maybe nursing school or a traditional Navy role. But Sarah had felt called to something more demanding. The training had been everything she had heard and more. Months of physical punishment designed to break down even the strongest candidates. Sleep deprivation, underwater exercises that tested the limits of human endurance, combat simulations that prepared them for the worst possible scenarios. The training was designed to push us beyond what we thought was possible, Sarah told the audience. They weren't just building our bodies. They were building our minds. They were teaching us to perform under pressure, to think clearly when everything around us was chaos. She had excelled in the medical training portions, but the combat elements had been more challenging. Not because she wasn't capable, but because they forced her to confront aspects of herself she hadn't known existed. The capacity for violence, the ability to make life and death decisions in split seconds, the willingness to put herself in harm's way for her teammates. After I graduated, I was assigned to SEAL Team 7, she said. My job was to provide medical support during operations. That meant I went wherever the team went, did whatever the team did, but I also had to be ready to save lives at any moment. The first deployment had been to Afghanistan. Sarah had been nervous but excited, finally getting to use her training in real situations. She had imagined scenarios where she would patch up minor injuries, maybe deal with some combat wounds. What she hadn't been prepared for was the intensity of special operations missions. My first real mission, she said, her voice growing quieter, was supposed to be routine. Intelligence gathering in a small village. We were supposed to be in and out without any contact with enemy forces. But nothing in that environment was ever routine. The village had been a trap, and Sarah's team had found themselves pinned down by enemy fire within minutes of their arrival. She had gone from nervous excitement to absolute terror in the span of heartbeats. That's when I learned that all the training in the world can't really prepare you for the moment when someone is shooting at you, she said. When you hear the sound of bullets flying past your head, when you see your teammates get hurt, when you realize that you might not make it home. The audience was completely silent now. Even the children who had been fidgeting earlier were still, sensing the weight of what they were hearing. Sarah had performed well that night, providing medical care under fire, helping to coordinate the team's evacuation, but the experience had marked her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The confidence she had built during training had been replaced by a new awareness of her own mortality and the randomness of violence. That was just the beginning, she said. Over the next 5 years, I went on dozens of missions. Some were successful, some weren't. I saved lives and I watched people die. I saw things that no one should have to see, and I did things that no one should have to do. Her voice was steady now, but her hands were trembling slightly. The young Marine in the audience was leaning forward, completely absorbed in her story. Other veterans in the room were nodding slightly, recognizing the weight of what she was describing. The hardest part wasn't the danger, Sarah continued. It was carrying all of that experience and not being able to talk about it. Most of our missions were classified. Even if they weren't, how do you explain to your family what it's like to hold someone's life in your hands? How do you describe the feeling of knowing that your decisions mean the difference between someone going home to their family or not? She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Her parents were in the third row, and she could see her mother wiping away tears. They were finally hearing about the part of her life that had been hidden from them for so long. I came home after 8 years, she said. Physically, I was mostly intact. A few scars, some minor injuries that healed well. But inside, I was carrying all of these experiences, all of these memories, and I didn't know how to talk about them. So I didn't talk at all. The silence that followed Sarah's last words wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people are processing something important, something that changes their understanding of the world around them. Sarah took a deep breath and continued. When I first came home, she said, everyone wanted to celebrate. My family threw parties. My old friends wanted to hear war stories, and the local newspaper wanted to write an article about the hometown hero. But I couldn't give them what they wanted. She remembered those first few months with painful clarity. Her childhood bedroom had felt like a museum, filled with trophies and photos from a person she no longer recognized. Her high school friends had seemed impossibly young, their concerns about jobs and relationships feeling trivial compared to what she had experienced overseas. I tried to go back to normal life, Sarah continued. I got a job at the clinic here in town, thinking that working in medicine would help me feel useful again. And in many ways it did. But civilian medicine was so different from what I had been doing. In Afghanistan and Iraq, Sarah had worked with gunshot wounds, blast injuries, and trauma that required split-second decisions with limited resources. At the Millfield Clinic, she dealt with routine checkups, minor injuries, and the occasional emergency. The pace was slower, the stakes seemed lower, and she found herself feeling disconnected from the work. Dr. Williams at the clinic was very patient with me, Sarah said, glancing toward the elderly physician who was sitting in the front row with his wife. He noticed that I was struggling, even though I tried to hide it. He was the one who suggested I talk to someone about what I had been through. Dr. Williams had served as a Navy medic in Vietnam, and he recognized the signs of post-traumatic stress that Sarah was exhibiting. The hypervigilance, the difficulty sleeping. The way she startled at sudden noises. More than that, he noticed how she seemed to be holding herself apart from everyone around her. At first, I resisted the idea of counseling, Sarah admitted. In the military, asking for help with mental health was often seen as a weakness. We were trained to push through, to be strong, to handle whatever came our way. The idea of sitting in an office talking about my feelings seemed— She paused, searching for the right word. Unnecessary. But Dr. Williams had been persistent, and eventually Sarah had agreed to see Dr. Patterson at the VA hospital in Dallas. The drive there had felt like a defeat, an admission that she wasn't as strong as she had thought she was. Dr. Patterson was different from what I expected, Sarah said. He was a veteran himself, Marine Corps from the First Gulf War. He understood what it meant to carry experiences that civilians couldn't relate to. He didn't try to fix me or rush me into talking about things I wasn't ready to discuss. The early sessions had been difficult. Sarah had sat in Dr. Patterson's office, staring at the certificates on his wall, the books about trauma recovery, the comfortable furniture that was designed to make people feel safe. But she hadn't felt safe. She had felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was completely different from the physical danger she had faced overseas. He told me something that stuck with me, Sarah said. He said that trauma isn't just about what happens to us. It's about what happens inside us when we can't talk about what happened to us. That concept had been a revelation for Sarah. She had always thought that her problem was the memories themselves, the images that flashed through her mind at unexpected moments, the dreams that woke her up in a cold sweat. But Dr. Patterson helped her understand that the isolation, the inability to share her experiences, was making everything worse. I spent 2 years working with Dr. Patterson, Sarah continued. Slowly, very slowly, I started to find words for things that had seemed impossible to describe. I learned that it was okay to feel proud of my service and traumatized by it at the same time. I learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. One of the breakthroughs had come when Dr. Patterson asked her to write letters to her former teammates. Not to send, but just to express what she wanted to say to them. Sarah had resisted at first, but eventually she had filled pages with thoughts and feelings she had been carrying for years. She wrote to Martinez, the team leader who had taught her how to stay calm under fire. She wrote to Johnson, the explosives expert who had a joke for every dangerous situation. She wrote to Cooper, who had been killed by an IED during their 3rd deployment together. Writing those letters helped me realize that I wasn't just carrying my own experiences, Sarah told the audience. I was carrying the experiences of my entire team, the weight of everyone who hadn't made it home, the responsibility of representing all of them in my civilian life. The audience was completely absorbed in her story now. Even the teenagers who had come with their families were listening intently, their phones forgotten in their pockets. But even after 2 years of therapy, I still struggled with talking about my experiences in public, Sarah said. I could discuss them in Dr. Patterson's office. I could write about them in my journal. But the idea of standing up in front of people and sharing my story still felt impossible. That had changed 6 months ago when Sarah had attended a similar veterans event in a neighboring town. She had gone as an observer, content to sit in the back and listen to other people's stories. But during the question and answer session, a young woman in the audience had asked if any female veterans were present. There were about 100 people in that room, Sarah said, and I was the only woman veteran. When she asked her question about what it was like to serve as a woman in the military, everyone turned to look at me. I could have stayed silent, could have let the moment pass, but something about her expression, the genuine curiosity and respect in her eyes, made me stand up. Sarah had only spoken for a few minutes that night, giving a brief overview of her service without going into details. But the response had been overwhelming. After the event, dozens of people had approached her, thanking her for her service, asking questions, expressing genuine interest in her experiences. That night, I realized that my silence wasn't just affecting me, Sarah said. There are young women out there who need to know that they can serve in any capacity they choose. There are veterans who need to know that they're not alone in their struggles. There are civilians who want to understand what military service really means. The decision to speak tonight hadn't been easy, but it had felt necessary. Sarah had spent weeks preparing, working with Dr. Patterson to identify the key points she wanted to make, the message she wanted to share. I'm standing here tonight not because I have all the answers, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm standing here because I finally understand that sharing our stories, even when it's difficult, even when it makes us vulnerable, is one of the most important things we can do. She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with individual faces. Her parents, who were seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Dr. Williams, who had guided her toward healing. The young Marine, who was absorbing every word. Mrs. Henderson, whose invitation had made this moment possible. "My story isn't over," Sarah said. "None of our stories are over. We're all still writing them every day, with every choice we make about how to use our experiences to help others." Sarah paused at the podium, feeling the weight of what she was about to share. The audience waited patiently, sensing that she was preparing to go deeper into her story. She had reached the point where she would need to trust them with the memories that had haunted her for years. "There's a mission I need to tell you about," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "It happened during my 4th deployment in a region of Afghanistan that most people have never heard of. We were sent to extract a captured intelligence officer who had been taken by Taliban forces. The mission had come with the highest priority classification. The captured officer, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Torres, had been part of the intelligence gathering operation that had gone wrong. She had been missing for 6 days when Sarah's team received the extraction order. Our team leader briefed us that this was a time-sensitive operation, Sarah continued. Every hour that passed meant less chance of bringing Torres home alive. The intelligence suggested she was being held in a compound about 40 miles from our base, in an area known for heavy enemy activity. Sarah remembered the pre-mission preparation with crystal clarity. The team had spent hours studying satellite images, planning entry and exit routes, identifying potential complications. As the medic, Sarah had prepared for multiple scenarios, loading her pack with extra blood products, surgical supplies, and pain medication. "I remember thinking that this was why I had joined the SEALs," she told the audience. "This was exactly the kind of mission where my medical training could make the difference between life and death for a fellow service member." The helicopter insertion had gone smoothly, landing the team about 2 miles from the target compound under cover of darkness. They had moved through the rocky terrain in complete silence, communicating only through hand signals and night vision equipment. When we reached the compound, we could see it was more heavily defended than our intelligence had suggested, Sarah said. There were at least 12 enemy fighters visible, and probably more inside the buildings. Our team leader had to make a decision: abort the mission and wait for additional support or proceed with the extraction attempt. The team had voted unanimously to proceed. Every minute of delay increased the risk to Torres, and they all knew that another opportunity might not come. They had trained for situations exactly like this, and they trusted their abilities and each other. The plan was for 3 team members to create a distraction on the north side of the compound, while the rest of us entered from the south, Sarah explained. My job was to locate Torres, assess her medical condition, and prepare her for extraction while the team secured the area. The initial phase had gone according to plan. The distraction had worked perfectly, drawing most of the enemy fighters away from the building where intelligence suggested Torres was being held. Sarah and 2 teammates had entered the compound without detection. We found Torres in a small room at the back of the main building, Sarah said, her voice growing tighter. She was alive, but barely. She had been beaten severely, had what appeared to be a broken arm, and was showing signs of dehydration and infection. Sarah had immediately begun medical assessment while her teammates secured the room. Torres was conscious but disoriented, and Sarah could see that she was in significant pain. The injuries were serious but not immediately life-threatening if they could get her medical attention quickly. I started an IV line and gave her pain medication, Sarah continued. She was able to tell me her name and confirm her identity, which was crucial for the mission. But as I was preparing her for transport, we heard gunfire from outside the building. The distraction team had been discovered, and the compound had erupted into chaos. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapons, the sharp crack of M4 rifles mixed with the deeper reports of AK-47s. Radio chatter indicated that the enemy had called for reinforcements. At that point, our simple extraction mission became a full combat operation, Sarah said. We had to fight our way out while carrying an injured teammate who couldn't walk on her own. Sarah had fashioned a makeshift stretcher using equipment from her pack and materials found in the room. With Torres secured, the team had begun moving toward their planned extraction point. but enemy fire had forced them to take a longer, more dangerous route. About halfway to the extraction point, one of my teammates, Petty Officer Collins, was hit by sniper fire, Sarah said, her voice becoming strained. The bullet caught him in the upper chest and he went down immediately. The sound that Collins had made when he was hit would stay with Sarah forever. Not a scream, but a surprised grunt followed by labored breathing. She had known immediately that it was a serious wound, the kind that required immediate medical intervention. I had a choice to make, Sarah told the audience. I could stay with Torres, who was stable but helpless, or I could go to Collins, who was bleeding badly but might be savable. My team leader made the decision for me. He ordered me to treat Collins while he took over Torres's care. Sarah had moved to Collins under heavy fire, her medical pack bouncing against her back as she low-crawled across rocky ground. When she reached him, she could see that the bullet had penetrated his chest cavity, and he was developing a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung that would kill him if she couldn't treat it immediately. I had to perform an emergency thoracostomy, Sarah explained to the audience. Essentially, I had to cut into his chest and insert a tube to allow the air to escape and his lung to re-expand. It's a procedure that's normally done in a sterile surgical environment, but I was doing it in the dirt while people were shooting at us. Her hands had been steady despite the chaos around her. The training had taken over, and she had focused entirely on the medical procedures while her teammates provided covering fire. Collins had remained conscious throughout the procedure, his eyes locked on hers as she worked. The procedure worked, Sarah said. Collins's breathing improved almost immediately, and I was able to stabilize him enough for transport. But we still had to get both casualties to the extraction point while under enemy fire. The team had been forced to call for close air support to suppress enemy positions. Sarah had continued to monitor both patients while moving, checking vital signs, adjusting IV rates, and managing pain medication. The extraction helicopter had finally arrived after what felt like hours, but was actually less than 30 minutes. We got everyone out, Sarah said simply. Torres made a full recovery and was back to duty within 6 months. Collins spent longer in rehabilitation, but he also returned to active duty. From a mission standpoint, it was considered a complete success. But for Sarah, the mission had marked a turning point. She had proven to herself and her team that she could perform under the most extreme conditions, that her medical training and combat skills could save lives when it mattered most. But she had also experienced a level of stress and responsibility that would stay with her long after the mission was over. That night taught me something important about myself, Sarah told the audience. I learned that I was capable of more than I had ever imagined. But I also learned that carrying that kind of responsibility, making those kinds of decisions under pressure, changes you in ways that are hard to explain to people who haven't been there. The audience remained completely silent, absorbed in her account. Sarah could see that her story was having an impact, that people were beginning to understand the complexity of military service, the weight that veterans carry long after their tours of duty are over. Sarah took a sip of water from the glass that Mrs. Henderson had quietly placed on the podium. Her throat was dry, and she could feel the emotional weight of what she had just shared, but she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. The story was finally being told. After that mission, she continued, something changed in how my teammates looked at me. I had proven myself under the worst possible conditions, and that earned me a level of respect and trust that I had been working toward for years. But the mission had also marked the beginning of a different kind of challenge for Sarah. The success had led to more high-risk assignments, more responsibility, and more exposure to the brutal realities of special operations warfare. Over the next year, our team was deployed to some of the most dangerous areas in Afghanistan and Iraq, she said. We conducted raids on high-value targets, provided medical support for other special operations teams, and participated in missions that I still can't talk about in detail. Each mission had added to the weight Sarah carried. She had saved more lives, but she had also lost teammates. She had seen violence that defied description, and she had participated in operations that had tested every moral and ethical boundary she thought she had. The hardest part wasn't the danger, Sarah told the audience. It was the isolation. Most of our missions were classified, which meant I couldn't talk about them with anyone outside of my team. I couldn't share the stress with my family, couldn't process the experiences with friends back home, couldn't even acknowledge that some of these events had happened. She thought about the letters she had written home during that period, They had been filled with generic updates about the weather, the food, and her general well-being. Nothing about the missions, nothing about the challenges she was facing, nothing about the person she was becoming. "My family thought I was doing well," Sarah said. "My letters were upbeat, and during the few phone calls I was able to make, I told them what they wanted to hear. I was safe, I was proud of my service, and I was looking forward to coming home." But the truth had been much more complicated. Sarah had been struggling with nightmares, with anxiety about upcoming missions, and with a growing sense that the person she had been before her military service was disappearing completely. "There was one mission," she said, her voice becoming quieter, "that I've never been able to talk about until tonight." The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing that she was about to share something particularly difficult. Sarah gripped the podium tighter, drawing strength from the supportive faces looking back at her. "We were tasked with capturing a Taliban leader who was coordinating attacks against coalition forces," she began. "The intelligence was solid, and the mission planning was thorough. Everything should have gone smoothly. The target compound had been larger than expected, with multiple buildings and more civilian presence than their intelligence had indicated. As the team had approached the main building, they had encountered unexpected resistance from guards who had been better trained and equipped than anticipated. During the firefight, I was treating a wounded teammate when I heard a sound that I'll never forget," Sarah said. It was a child crying. The sound had come from a small building adjacent to the main compound. Sarah had realized immediately that there were civilians in the area, something that complicated every aspect of their mission. "I made a decision that I probably shouldn't have made," she continued. "I left my wounded teammate with another medic and went to investigate the sound." Sarah had found a small girl, probably 5 or 6 years old, hiding in a corner of what appeared to be a storage building. The child had been terrified, obviously caught in the crossfire of the battle happening around her. "She was injured," Sarah said simply. "Shrapnel from an explosion had cut her leg and she was bleeding badly." Without hesitation, Sarah had begun treating the child's wounds. The girl had been too frightened to speak, but she had stopped crying as Sarah worked, seeming to understand that this strange woman in military gear was trying to help her. "I spent about 10 minutes with her," Sarah said. "I stopped the bleeding, bandaged the wound, and gave her some water from my pack. I tried to tell her in the few words of Pashto I knew that everything would be okay." The moral complexity of the situation had not been lost on Sarah. Here she was, part of a military operation that had brought violence to this child's community, but also providing medical care that might have saved the girl's life. "When I rejoined my team, my leader was furious," Sarah continued. "I had violated protocol by leaving my assigned position, and I had potentially compromised the mission by exposing myself to additional risk." But Sarah hadn't regretted her decision. The image of that frightened child had stayed with her, becoming a reminder of the human cost of the conflicts she was participating in. "That night marked the beginning of my struggle with what psychologists call moral injury," she explained to the audience. "It's different from PTSD. It happens when you're forced to participate in events that conflict with your deeply held beliefs about right and wrong." Sarah had always believed that her role as a medic was to save lives, to heal rather than harm. But special operations missions often involved violence that resulted in casualties, both military and civilian. The contradiction between her role as a healer and her participation in combat operations had become increasingly difficult to reconcile. "I started questioning everything," she said. "Why was I there? Was what we were doing making things better or worse? How could I justify saving lives on one hand while participating in operations that took lives on the other?" These questions had consumed Sarah during her final year of active duty. She had continued to perform her duties professionally, but internally she had been struggling with doubts that she couldn't share with anyone. "The military doesn't really prepare you for these kinds of moral dilemmas," she told the audience. "They teach you about rules of engagement, about law of war, about following orders. But they don't teach you how to handle it when your heart and your head are telling you different things." Sarah had considered talking to a chaplain, but she had been afraid that expressing doubts about her missions might affect her security clearance, or her standing with her team. The culture of special operations emphasized mental toughness and unwavering commitment to the mission. "So I kept everything inside," she said. "I told myself that these feelings were normal, that everyone struggled with these issues, that I just needed to be stronger. But the internal conflict had continued to grow. Sarah had found herself becoming more withdrawn, more serious, less connected to the camaraderie that had originally attracted her to special operations. By the time my tour ended, she said, I was a different person than I had been when I first put on the uniform. I was technically proficient, physically capable, and professionally respected. But inside I was carrying so much weight that I didn't know how to set down. The decision to leave active duty hadn't been easy. Sarah had been offered opportunities to stay, to take on leadership roles, to continue advancing in her career. But she had known that she needed time and space to process what she had experienced. When I came home to Millfield, she said, I thought that returning to civilian life would somehow make everything simpler. I thought that being away from the military environment would allow me to go back to being the person I had been before. But as she had quickly discovered, there was no going back. The experiences had become part of who she was, and learning to live with them would require a different kind of courage than anything she had demonstrated on the battlefield. Sarah looked out at the audience, seeing her own journey reflected in their faces. Some looked overwhelmed by what she had shared. Others seemed to be processing their own experiences, and a few were wiping away tears. She had reached the most difficult part of her story, the part about coming home. The hardest battle I ever fought, she said, wasn't in Afghanistan or Iraq. It was right here in Millfield, in my childhood bedroom, trying to figure out how to be a civilian again. The homecoming had been everything her family had hoped for, and nothing like what Sarah had needed. There had been a banner hanging across Main Street welcoming her home, a small ceremony at City Hall where the mayor presented her with a key to the city, and a party at her parents' house with extended family and friends. Everyone wanted to celebrate the hero who had come home, Sarah continued, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like an imposter, like I was pretending to be someone I used to be. The disconnection had been immediate and profound. Conversations that had once felt natural now seemed forced. Her old friends talked about their jobs, their relationships, their weekend plans, and Sarah had found herself unable to relate to any of it. My high school friends wanted to know if I had killed anyone, she said. They asked it like it was a simple question, like they were asking about the weather. They didn't understand that even if I could answer that question, it wasn't one that should be asked casually over drinks at the local bar. The job at Dr. Williams's clinic had been a lifeline, giving Sarah structure and purpose when everything else felt chaotic. But even there, she had struggled with the transition from military medicine to civilian healthcare. In the military, medical decisions were often life or death, made quickly with limited resources under extreme pressure, she explained. At the clinic, I found myself getting frustrated with patients who complained about minor ailments, or who didn't follow medical advice for conditions that were easily treatable. Dr. Williams had been patient with her adjustment, understanding from his own experience how difficult the transition could be. But Sarah had recognized that her impatience and emotional distance were affecting her work and her relationships with patients. I started having nightmares, she said, her voice becoming quieter, not about specific missions but about feeling trapped, about being unable to help people who needed me, about failing my teammates in situations that made no logical sense. The nightmares had been accompanied by other symptoms that Sarah had initially tried to ignore: hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax in public spaces, an exaggerated startle response that embarrassed her in social situations, and a persistent feeling of being on edge that exhausted her mentally and physically. My parents knew something was wrong, Sarah continued. They could see that I wasn't the same person who had left for the military 8 years earlier. But they didn't know how to help, and I didn't know how to explain what I was experiencing. The conversations with her family had been particularly painful. Her mother had wanted to nurture and comfort her, but Sarah had felt unable to accept that kind of care. Her father had tried to engage her in activities they had once enjoyed together, but Sarah had found herself going through the motions without feeling any real connection. The worst part was feeling like I was disappointing them, she said. They had sacrificed and worried for 8 years while I was deployed. They had looked forward to having their daughter back home. But the person who came back wasn't really their daughter anymore. Sarah had tried to force herself back into her old patterns, attending family gatherings, going out with friends, participating in community events. But every social interaction had felt like a performance, like she was playing a role that no longer fit. About 6 months after I came home, she said, I had what Dr. Patterson later called a panic attack. I was at the grocery store and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. The sounds of shopping carts and conversations became overwhelming, and I felt like I had to get out of there immediately. Sarah had abandoned her cart and walked quickly to her car, where she had sat for 20 minutes trying to calm down. The experience had frightened her because it had seemed to come from nowhere, triggered by nothing more threatening than a routine trip to buy groceries. That's when Dr. Williams suggested I talk to someone, she said. He didn't use words like PTSD or trauma. He just said that sometimes it helps to process difficult experiences with someone who understands. The suggestion to see Dr. Patterson had initially felt like an admission of failure to Sarah. She had survived combat operations, had saved lives under extreme pressure, had earned the respect of some of the most elite warriors in the military. The idea that she couldn't handle civilian life seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about herself. My first session with Dr. Patterson was awkward, she admitted. I sat in his office and tried to convince him that I was fine, that maybe I just needed time to adjust, that the panic attack had been an isolated incident. But Dr. Patterson had been skilled at reading between the lines. He had asked gentle questions that helped Sarah recognize the patterns in her behavior, the ways that her military experiences were affecting her daily life. He helped me understand that seeking help wasn't a sign of weakness, Sarah said. He explained that the human mind wasn't designed to process the kind of experiences I had had without support. He said that my symptoms weren't a character flaw. They were a normal response to abnormal situations. The therapy process had been slow and sometimes painful. Dr. Patterson had helped Sarah identify the specific experiences that were affecting her most, had taught her coping strategies for managing anxiety and intrusive thoughts, and had gradually helped her develop a vocabulary for discussing her military experiences. One of the most important things he taught me, Sarah said, was that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean that my military experiences didn't matter, or that I should pretend they didn't happen. It means learning to integrate those experiences into my identity in a way that allows me to move forward. Sarah had also learned that her struggles were not unique. Through group therapy sessions with other veterans, she had discovered that many of the feelings and experiences she thought were personal failings were actually common responses to military service. Meeting other veterans who were going through similar struggles was incredibly helpful, she told the audience. It reminded me that I wasn't broken or weak, I was human. And like all humans, I needed support and connection to heal. The healing process had been gradual, with setbacks and breakthroughs that didn't follow any predictable pattern. Some days Sarah had felt like she was making real progress. Other days the weight of her experiences had seemed overwhelming. But slowly, over time, I started to feel like myself again, she said. Not the person I had been before the military, but someone new who could incorporate all of my experiences into a coherent sense of identity. The decision to speak publicly about her experiences had been the culmination of that healing process. Sarah had realized that her story might help other veterans feel less alone, might help civilians better understand what military service entails, and might help her continue to process her own experiences. Standing here tonight, she said, talking to all of you feels like the completion of a circle. I'm finally able to take the experiences that once felt like burdens and use them to connect with other people, to contribute to my community in a meaningful way. Sarah paused, looking out at the faces that had been with her through this entire journey of words. The community center had become completely silent, the kind of silence that holds weight and meaning. She could see that her story had touched something deep in many of the people listening. I want to talk about what healing actually looks like, she said, her voice now strong and clear, because I think sometimes we have unrealistic expectations about what it means to recover from difficult experiences. She had learned through her work with Dr. Patterson that healing wasn't a destination but an ongoing process. There wasn't a moment when she had suddenly felt cured, or when all of her symptoms had disappeared. Instead, there had been gradual changes in how she understood and responded to her experiences. Healing doesn't mean that I don't still have difficult days, Sarah explained. I still sometimes have nightmares. I still feel anxious in certain situations. I still carry the weight of decisions I made and things I witnessed overseas. But what had changed was her relationship to those experiences. Instead of feeling overwhelmed and isolated by them, she had learned to see them as part of a larger story of service, sacrifice, and ultimately growth. The difference is that now I have tools for managing the difficult feelings, she continued. I have people I can talk to when I'm struggling. I have ways of understanding my experiences that help me make sense of them, rather than feeling haunted by them. Sarah had also discovered that her military experiences, as difficult as they had been, had given her strengths and perspectives that were valuable in civilian life. Her ability to remain calm under pressure served her well in medical emergencies at the clinic. Her experience working with diverse teams had made her an effective leader in community organizations. Her understanding of sacrifice and service had deepened her appreciation for the freedoms and opportunities available in civilian life. One of the most important realizations I've had, she said, is that my military service doesn't define me, but it is an important part of who I am. I don't have to hide from it or be ashamed of it, but I also don't have to let it be the only thing that matters about me. She looked directly at the young Marine who had been listening so intently throughout her speech. His expression had changed over the course of the evening, from nervous uncertainty to recognition to something that looked like hope. To the veterans in this room, Sarah said, I want you to know that whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone. There are people who understand what you've been through. There are resources available to help you process your experiences, and there is no shame in asking for help. She had learned that one of the biggest barriers to veterans seeking support was the stigma around mental health in military culture. The emphasis on strength and self-reliance, while valuable in combat situations, could become counterproductive when it prevented people from getting the help they needed. Seeking help takes courage, Sarah said. It takes the same kind of courage that you showed when you put on the uniform and deployed to dangerous places. Don't let anyone tell you that taking care of your mental health is a sign of weakness. She turned her attention to the civilians in the audience, many of whom had been hearing details about military service that they had never encountered before. To the civilians in this room, she said, I want you to understand that the veterans in your community are carrying experiences that are difficult to talk about. They may seem different from who they were before they deployed, and that's because they are different. War changes people. But that change, Sarah had learned, wasn't necessarily negative. Many veterans returned with enhanced skills, deeper appreciation for life, stronger relationships, and clearer priorities. The challenge was helping them integrate their military experiences with their civilian identity. What veterans need most from their communities, Sarah continued, is patience, understanding, and practical support. They need job opportunities that match their skills. They need health care that addresses both physical and mental health needs. They need social connections that don't require them to pretend that their military service didn't happen. Sarah had been fortunate to return to a community that had been supportive, even when they didn't fully understand what she had experienced. Dr. Williams had provided professional opportunity and mentorship. Mrs. Henderson and others had included her in community activities without pressuring her to talk about her service before she was ready. Her parents had given her space while making it clear that they loved and supported her. I also want to speak directly to the young people in this room, Sarah said, noticing several teenagers who had been surprisingly attentive throughout her speech. Military service is one way to serve your country and challenge yourself, but it's not the only way. Whatever path you choose, remember that you have the power to make a positive difference in the world. She thought about her own teenage years, when she had been searching for ways to test herself and contribute to something larger than her own immediate concerns. Military service had provided that opportunity, but there were many other paths to meaningful service. The most important thing, she said, is to stay connected to other people. Whether you choose military service, college, a trade, or any other path, remember that we all need community, support, and the opportunity to share our experiences with people who care about us. Sarah had learned that isolation was one of the most dangerous aspects of trauma. When people carried difficult experiences alone, those experiences could grow distorted and overwhelming. But when those same experiences were shared in supportive environments, they could become sources of wisdom, strength, and connection. I'm standing here tonight because I finally found my voice again, she said, but I couldn't have done it alone. I needed Dr. Patterson's professional expertise, Dr. Williams' mentorship, my parents' unconditional love, and this community's patience and support. She paused, looking around the room one more time, trying to capture the faces that had listened to her story with such attention and respect. "My story isn't unique," she said. "There are thousands of veterans with similar experiences, thousands of people who have served their country in difficult circumstances and then struggled to find their place in civilian life. But every story is also individual, personal, and important." Sarah had come to understand that sharing her story wasn't just about her own healing. It was about creating space for other people to share their stories, about building connections across the civilian-military divide, and about contributing to a community conversation about service, sacrifice, and healing. "I want to end with this," she said. "We are all works in progress. We are all carrying experiences that have shaped us, some positive and some difficult. The goal isn't to become perfect or to pretend that difficult things haven't happened to us. The goal is to keep growing, keep connecting with other people, and keep finding ways to use our experiences to make the world a little bit better." She stepped back from the podium, and for a moment the room remained completely silent. Then slowly the applause began. It started with just a few people and gradually built until the entire room was clapping. But it wasn't the polite applause that often followed community speeches. It was the kind of applause that carried emotion, recognition, and gratitude. Sarah stood at the front of the room, no longer the wordless veteran who had struggled in silence. She had found her voice, shared her story, and in doing so, had reminded everyone present of the power of human connection in the face of even the most difficult experiences. The crowd had grown quiet when she began speaking, but now they were anything but quiet. They were engaged, moved, and connected to her story, and to each other in a way that would continue long after the evening ended.